Okay. So first of all, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Soumita Basu, who is a feminist international relations scholar joining us from the South Asian University in New Delhi. She'll be giving a presentation linking contemporary feminist peace work in South Asia with women, peace and security. And we're really excited to welcome you today. I think Amira has some slides to share, so I'm just going to mute myself and Dr. Soumita to start.
Okay, many thanks, Susie and Amira, and indeed the Welsh Centre for International Affairs for organizing this discussion and for inviting me to participate. I wrote my PhD on the WPS agenda at Aberystwyth University now several years ago, but I am just thrilled to come back to Wales in a manner of speaking and share my ongoing work on WPS here. And of course, it is a pleasure to be on the same panel as Katharine and Toni, whose work I greatly admire. The presentation that I'm making today is based on a chapter that I'm writing for an edited volume on feminist international relations in South Asia. And as you can see from the slide, there are two parts to the title of my presentation, WPS and Feminist South Asia. And just to add to what Susie has already said on WPS, I have the second slide, Amira, thank you, which lists the 10 resolutions on women and peace and security, starting with Resolution 1325, which was adopted in October 2000. And so the WPS agenda is associated with these 10 resolutions and all the international, regional, national policy architecture has come up around it. And it's important to note here that civil society actors were absolutely central to the drafting process especially of the first resolution. And they have really pushed for the implementation of 1325 and the subsequent 9 WPS resolutions. Now, traditionally, the agenda was associated with the 3 pillars of protection, prevention, and participation, the 3 Ps that you see on the slide. So this was about protection of women and girls in armed conflicts and recognizing and promoting the participation of women in peace processes and conflict prevention. And then later, relief and recovery was added to this as well. So this was about taking a gender-sensitive approach to relief and recovery processes. And since then, the WPS agenda has come to include issues such as countering violent extremism at the Security Council. And in many parts of the world, it has been incorporated into policies relating to disasters, development, cybersecurity, migration, climate change, etc. And if you'd like to find out more, the Peace Women website of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is an excellent resource. And closer to you, the London School of Economics has a Center for Women, Peace and Security that too has generated very useful analysis on WPS. And while I've been speaking, maybe you've looked at some specific aspects of these resolutions that I have mentioned in the bottom half of the slide. And I'd be happy to talk more about the international politics in the Q&A. For the rest of the presentation, however, I will focus on the second part of the presentation's title, which is Feminist South Asia. And to be precise, and we can now move on to the next slide, thank you, Amira, which is what has the WPS meant for feminist peace work in South Asia? And specifically, 2 questions that I'd like for us to consider. So 2 sides of the same coin, the pros and cons and so on. How has the WPS served as a resource for feminist peace work in the region? And then on the other hand, what are the dangers in engaging with WPS in South Asia? So basically, we'll be looking into what this international policy agenda has meant for a specific region. Very quickly, as an aside of sorts, you may or may not be surprised to learn that there are debates on which countries are even part of South Asia. For example, is Myanmar or Burma part of it? So for the purposes of the discussion, I'm going to go with countries that are part of the regional organization that we have here, which is the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. So that means I'm looking at Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, the Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and from 2007 onwards, Afghanistan. In fact, the university that I work at has also been set up by SAARC, and we have students from all of these countries. I won't be discussing kind of national level politics, but focus on the regional dimensions. And in that regard, it would also be good to clarify at this point that at the intergovernmental, because I use the term feminist South Asia, so at the intergovernmental level, I think it's safe to say that South Asia is not a region that runs on feminist principles, and that is probably true for most regions. Indeed, in an early contribution on potential feminist foreign policy, a term that you might have come across, so this was with regard to having one for India, Ambassador Nirupama Rao from India, she appeared to characterize the South Asian diplomatic community as, and I quote, an arena for mutual jousting where we bait each other in blood sport, end quote, and she called for it to be re-envisioned as, and I quote again, space for maturity of peaceful purpose, robust civility, and mutual accommodation, end quote. But at the level of civil society, so I mentioned the intergovernmental level just now, but at the level of civil society, there is a very strong legacy of feminist peace work in the region, with stalwarts such as, and I'll just take a few names because otherwise that would be the end of the presentation. So Kamla Bhasin from India, Rubina Saigol from Pakistan, Hamida Hussain from Bangladesh, Bandana Rana from Nepal, Malati Alves from Sri Lanka, and many others who have really collectively nurtured a feminist vision for a peaceful region. And this has been very kind of multifaceted. And to give us a sense of it, I want to refer to a monograph titled Freedom from Fear, Freedom from Want, Rethinking Security in Bangladesh, which was co-written by Hamida Hussain and Meghna Goa Thakurda from Bangladesh and Malini Sood from India. And their narrative draws on, you know, when I start listing them, you'll see that they seem like very kind of separate issues. So they say, you know, they look at violence against women during Bangladesh's liberation war in 1971, experiences of women in Bangladesh's minority communities, and then Malini Sood's chapter in that book, it begins with an account of a brutal murder of Karunamai Shardar, who stood up against commercialization of shrimp fishing in a coastal district. So all of these sound very, very different. But of course, if we look at it from a holistic feminist perspective, and as the authors do, they argue that, you know, they show us that violence that's implicit in macro processes such as a nationalist war, development, and internal relocation, and commercialization of local economies, and you know, they can be related to just the micro level of the household as well. And feminists would be familiar with this idea of continuum of violence. And so gendered violence manifests in multiple ways in the region, but on the plus side, so do efforts to build peace. So this is just sort of illustrative of feminist peace thinking in the region, which of course, I mean, coming to WPS now predates the adoption of 1325 in 2000. So then our question is, well, you know, after 1325 was adopted in 2000, what has that meant for feminist peace work? And I have split this discussion into two parts: the ideational dimension that focuses on the terms of the discourse, and the material dimension that focuses on the political economy of the women, peace, and security agenda. And of course, this is just an analytical choice. In practice, of course, you know, these are all kind of working together, they're interconnected, they're shaping each other. Now, in the South Asian context, the WPS agenda has a very checkered history. Only three countries in the region have adopted what are called national action plans. So these are plans adopted by countries to implement 1325. And last I checked, according to the Peace Women website, there are now 103 member states, UN member states, that have adopted national action plans. In South Asia, there are three. Nepal, which really, it was the second in Asia, in fact, when it adopted its NAP in 2011, then Afghanistan in 2015, and Bangladesh fairly recently in 2019. But we also see, and besides these national action plans, we see the language of WPS has been used by international actors, including UN Women, European Union, donor organizations, and so on in the region. And as I said, I mean, much can be said also about the government's response in different countries, but I'm just focusing on the feminist community in South Asia. And one final point before we move on to those two aspects, the ideational and material parts, which is to clarify that this WPS South Asia dynamic is not a one-way street. The WPS agenda, I think I referred to this earlier as well, reflects decades of feminist advocacy on peace and security issues. Yes, it does not go far enough, but it is feminist peace builders that really push for the radical idea in international policy circles that gender matters in armed conflicts. And if any of you are interested in the South Asian story of this, one, of course, the ambassador from Bangladesh at the UN was quite pivotal in 2000, but also as far as the civil society account is concerned, there's a co-written piece by Roshmi Goswami, Kumudini Samuel, and Nigat Said Khan from India, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan, respectively, and they talk about their involvement. They call it Her Story: Women and Peace Movements in South Asia. Their involvement with the adoption of WPS agenda. But then, of course, they go on to say that, and I'll go on to discuss this as well, that they have sort of distanced themselves from it because they wanted the resolution to be in General Assembly and not Security Council. But, I'll save that for later, or maybe in the Q&A. So let's now answer these two questions that you see on the slide. So we can now move on to the next slide, which it relates to the previous one, please, the ideational dimension part. Yes, thank you, Amira. So as a resource for feminist peace builders in the region, WPS is seen as part of the larger international policy architecture on gender issues. So you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, CEDAW, the Beijing Platform for Action, among others, which can be used to draw attention to local issues. For example, the Nepal National Action Plan, drawing on substantive civil society contributions, takes note of multiple categories of conflict-affected women, including widows, who were not mentioned in the early set of WPS resolutions that were adopted by the Council. So what we find that in civil society publications that do talk about 1325, it appears to be a distant normative reference that is used to strengthen the case for more organically identified concerns. But this, as you can expect, is only one part of the story, because of course the WPS agenda also reproduces global power hierarchies, including those implicit in liberal peace building. So reflecting on the engagement with the WPS agenda in Sri Lanka, Vasuki Nesaya writes that in the process, and she writes, Sri Lanka is produced as a conflict zone that, and I quote, now requires international intervention to restore order. So what does this mean? I could also link it to, if you've come across Anne Orford's work on humanitarian intervention, it's kind of interesting that she writes that in international legal texts, this international, which would include something like the WPS agenda, is considered to be absent in kind of ongoing local violence and deprivation, but then kind of comes in as a heroic savior, as Anne Orford puts it. So it's as if, WPS is the kind of international resource, and that the international was absent earlier when the way the conflict shaped up in Sri Lanka, for instance, when that was happening. So this sort of also captures critics' take on the push for implementation of 1325 by international actors. It's just convenient for being kind of interventionist. And a related danger is that the terms of this dominant international discourse can overwhelm, to put it mildly, local articulations of feminist concerns. And this, if I take the example of Afghanistan, it's quite evident. So 2 decades of US-led intervention in the country was, as you would know, was saturated with rhetoric of women's rights and empowerment. But then an organization that stood for women's rights since the late 1970s, the Revolutionary Association of Women in Afghanistan, or RAWA, that was completely sidelined during this time. Why? Possibly because it was critical of the US presence in Afghanistan. And it's interesting that they are visible again now that majority of the internationally sponsored programs are frozen. Relatedly, there's also the sort of physical distance between the location of international policymaking and funding bodies and the local in South Asia. There's Poonam Yadav, a colleague of ours, she has an LSE working paper on WPS in Nepal with a very catchy title, it refers to the fact that her respondent shares that people in rural areas wonder if 1325 is a taxi number. And so she cites, and I quote, they may memorize it for once, but they forget after the program is finished because the Security Council does not sound real to them. So these are the 2 aspects of the ideational dimension, and we can now move on to the final slide, which is about the material dimension of engaging with the WPS agenda. Now, it was clear to a number of gender advocates familiar with UN resolutions that 1325 could only go so far. As Jennifer Clott, who was a former senior governance advisor at UNIFEM at that time, now UN Women, had noted, its provisions are, and I quote, as specific and narrow as is the Security Council's mandate. And that's part, and end quote, which is partly why presumably several feminists from the region chose not to engage with 1325. But what the agenda does do is that it can be used to bring in funds for gender-related projects in conflict-affected societies. It can also spur governments to invest in relevant initiatives. I've been tracking the Indian government's role, for instance, and it has made some donations in this regard in its own area of interest, which relates to peacekeeping. And so it has made some significant donations to the UN in the last 6-7 years. But this kind of also then, we can see, well, what might be the problems with this issue as well. So be it the Indian government donating to the UN or international organizations and donor agencies funding programs in South Asia, these are directed to transform the sort of distant other. Someone out there needs to change, and not these parties that are doing, giving the donations. So only certain kinds of programs are funded. And as many critics have pointed out, there is also instrumentalization of the agenda along particular lines. And again, Vasaki Nisaya, who I quoted earlier, she also talks about how she looks at these economic empowerment programs in Sri Lanka, which were there to implement 1325. And she notes that, and I'll quote because I think it's an easy quote. I can go ahead and just read out what she says, that Resolution 1325 implementation could be invoked to legitimate globally hegemonic economic choices by focusing on the inclusion of women as economic actors. So the participation agenda, rather than specific economic policies that will shape the script within which they act. So basically, we are not then, what she's saying is that we are not challenging sort of business as usual, quite literally, when it comes to the political economy of war and peace. So this donor-led agenda does not merely reproduce the global hierarchies, but also creates and exasperates differences within the civil society in the grant-making process. those that speak the vocabulary and are good at writing grant applications will get those grants. And then certain kinds of projects, those that tick internationally laid out indicators, for instance, are preferred. But the other issues still remain. So Bandana Rana's experience with WPS agenda offers, this is in Nepal, gives us a good example. And I'll end with this because we are close to the 20-minute mark, I think. So she says that, and I quote, where the donor's logo will be profiled, such as anniversaries of Resolution 1325, or when we are supporting the government to develop a new national action plan on women, peace, and security. But then when it comes to nitty-gritty, the money disappears. So I think I'll just stop there. I hope you could see both on, in terms of the ideational and the material dimension, what has, how has the WPS agenda served as a resource, but, and I may have spent more time on this, that there are several challenges to it as well. And it could be, in fact, somewhat dangerous in certain cases, especially when it comes to really putting organic interests and local voices at the forefront. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. And I did forget I was chairing and looking at the time then, because I was so engaged in what you were saying. And I have so many questions, but I am going to save them to the end. And also, just before I go to the next speaker, just to remind attendees that you can feel free to put your questions in the Q&A as well, for each of our speakers. But yeah, thank you so much. So I'm going to come straight to Dr. Katharine Wright, who's a feminist who's Dr. Katharine Wright, who's a senior lecturer in international politics at Newcastle University, and the co-convener of the Military, War and Security Research Group. She's going to be focusing today on the gendered silences in the West's approach to the Russia-Ukraine war. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Dr. Katharine Wright. So if you're okay, do you have any slides, or are you just speaking with us today?
Yeah, sorry. Not quite a Zoom expert yet after 2.5 years.
That's
yeah,
okay, Katharine.
Slides, so I'll share them now. Can you see those?
Yeah, those are visible. Thank you very much.
Great. Yeah, so I'm looking today, and I'm also a feminist scholar. And thank you, Susie and Amira, for the invitation. And it's really great to be here with Soumita and Toni. And I think my presentation and intervention here builds a little bit on Soumita's critique of women, peace and security, but from a slightly different angle. So I'm going to be looking at the gendered silences in the West, and I thought specifically for this presentation, NATO's response to the Russia-Ukraine war, and specifically the kind of full-scale military intervention, invasion that we saw in February this year. So this is a few of the things that I've published over the last kind of 6 months, trying to grapple with this issue and get to terms with the implications for the women, peace and security agenda. Because to give you a clue, NATO and most of the West have been completely silent on their commitments to women, peace and security in responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where actually we might expect and should expect that WPS would be more relevant than ever, both in acknowledging Ukrainian women's agency, but also in seeking to understand kind of the gendered impact of the conflict on people of all genders. But before we get to that, I think to unpack this puzzle, we need to go back a little bit. So NATO adopted its first policy on women, peace and security in 2007. So some of the feminist civil society who were active in supporting the WPS agenda and pushing it through the Security Council were really outraged at this development. They argued that WPS wasn't about making war safe for women, and that NATO's engagement would militarize the agenda. So this is quite an important critique to consider. that being said, not much attention was actually given to NATO's work on WPS. Certainly, I'd say for the first kind of 7 years or so. So they adopted the policy in 2007. I started researching NATO's work on WPS and in 2012, and there are a couple of other scholars such as Matthew Hurley who began to look at it around the same time. But among the wider WPS community, I think there's kind of a challenge on what to make of NATO's engagement and what the implications were. So I think a couple of interesting things to note about how NATO has interpreted women, peace and security. So it's also important to note that it hadn't at that point in the early days kind of engaged with civil society on WPS. And if we think about civil society, given their role in advocating for WPS as kind of the knowledge brokers of the agenda, this is both surprising in some senses, but also quite alarming. So NATO has been very vocal about its work on WPS. So it's been a core part of its public diplomacy strategy. It has done a number of kind of various initiatives to showcase its work on WPS, and it's always talking about its work on WPS. And I've kind of called it NATO's kind of good news story. And indeed, I think it was in 2018 that NATO partnered with Angelina Jolie, of course, who's also a UN Goodwill Ambassador, on WPS. And I've done a little bit of work with Annika Bergman-Rosamond looking at kind of the implications for that and how it actually enabled NATO to exploit its work on WPS and with Angelina Jolie to reach kind of new audiences. So people that wouldn't normally engage with a military alliance. So in particular, women, they're a completely different reach in terms of the social media and wider media impact of that partnership. So WPS has been, on the one hand, a good news story, a bit of kind of public relations material for NATO. On the other hand, it's also been about implementing a gender perspective in military operations. So this is about both increasing operational effectiveness, so we can think back to those earlier kind of warning signs from feminist civil society that WPS shouldn't be about making war safe for women, and question if that's what NATO is doing here. And they've also used it to reinforce their existing efforts to increase the representation of women in NATO armed forces, so across their member states, but that was pre-existing to WPS. They also, so I think it was 2012, they appointed a high-level special representative for women, peace and security. So this is an earlier incumbent of the role that sat there with the NATO Secretary General. So you've got Mariette Schuurman and Jens Stoltenberg, the current NATO Secretary General. And that special representative has had actually quite an important role, both in terms of pushing NATO internally to do WPS better, but also in fostering relations with feminist civil society, who can then provide that scrutiny of what NATO is doing on WPS. So this has been an important development, and one that I think provides some potential to better shape what NATO is doing on WPS. So the other thing that's really interesting about NATO's work on WPS is that there's a huge role for WPS in terms of building partnerships with non-member states. Okay, so states outside of NATO that NATO might not normally have relations with. So Sweden's one example of that, and there's a whole other thing to say about Sweden's impending membership of NATO and the place of WPS within it. But certainly WPS has been central to Sweden's role at NATO as a partner. But NATO has also, or had also, built its relations with Ukraine up till February 2022 on WPS. So Ukraine is actually a signatory as a partner to NATO's policy on women, peace and security. NATO has put had put huge resource into Ukraine to support Ukraine's own development of a national action plan. But as kind of Mila O'Sullivan and also Jenny Mathers have highlighted, this has led to kind of a militarized approach to WPS within Ukraine. So a very narrow understanding of WPS in some senses, in that it only or largely concerns the recruitment of women into the armed forces and not kind of the wider issues in terms of transforming how we approach and conduct peace and security. So that then brings us to NATO's response to the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February this year. So this really saw, as we all know, NATO return to its Article 5, so its collective defense purpose. We have kind of NATO troops deployed on NATO's kind of eastern flank. We have kind of a lot of images coming out in terms of public diplomacy of lots of kind of soldiers and propping up NATO's eastern flank and kind of protecting NATO. Now, we might also expect, given this relationship NATO has or had with Ukraine on WPS, that women, peace and security would be central to NATO's response to the Russian-Ukraine war. So we might still have seen, you know, the soldiers being put on NATO's eastern flank, but we might also have had gender advisors deployed with them. And there's no evidence that gender advisors have been deployed on NATO's eastern flank. But also we might have expected, given that women, peace and security has been so important for NATO in terms of public diplomacy, and that part of responding to Russia's kind of invasion and the war that Russia is waging is very much kind of a hybrid war. So it's not just about the territorial invasion, like this is a war for in terms of values, that this would be a moment for NATO to reinforce the values that it is supposed to be protecting. So those values encapsulated in the North Atlantic Treaty, but also its commitment to the women, peace and security agenda. And actually part of the women, peace and security agenda is ensuring that women's agency is acknowledged, particularly kind of conflict affected women. But as Ukrainian feminist Maria Dmitrieva argues, coverage of the war almost never speaks about women as agents. We get a lot of coverage of women as victims. So we don't therefore see the hundreds of thousands of women who locally work with internally displaced people, refugees, those who need help right now. So these are not mentioned in international media. And so what I argue is that media coverage plays out against a broader gendered silence in the public diplomatic response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine by NATO and by the West more broadly, so by NATO member states, including the UK. So we haven't got gender advisors deployed. We don't have NATO reaffirming its values in terms of defending kind of women, peace and security and saying what's so important now. We don't have evidence, at least from the conversations that I've had with Ukrainian civil society, that NATO is reaching out to them to find out what support they might need that NATO could give. And this is actually quite significant in a way. So NATO established, it didn't initially engage with civil society on WPS, but in 2014, it did establish a civil society advisory panel to reach women in NATO member states, but also in partner states, including Ukraine. So it has the mechanism to engage Ukrainian women incredibly effectively. It's just the case, from what I can gather from speaking to Ukrainian civil society, that it's not doing so. So that's kind of where we're at. So you think, okay, WPS is dead. NATO's not doing WPS anymore. And then we have the NATO strategic concept. So this essentially puts forward NATO's ambition for the next kind of 8 years. So looking forward to 2030, this was agreed to huge kind of fanfare at NATO's Madrid summit in June, some point over the summer. And what's front and center of this? Women, peace and security. So this is also the first time that women, peace and security and human security and climate change have been included in NATO strategic concepts. So this looks hugely significant, but we also have this crazy contradiction where NATO is being completely silent on the issue that is completely preoccupying the alliance. So yeah, I don't have answers there, but you can kind of see where this is now preoccupying my academic life. So the other twist in this puzzle, of course, is that we have Sweden and Finland joining NATO. Both Finland and Sweden have been important kind of supporters of women, peace and security at NATO. At one point, in about 2014, when I did my interviews at NATO, it was basically Sweden as a partner state doing WPS for NATO. It was Swedish gender advisors in the room. It was Sweden kind of putting the language into documents, which is an insane level of access to a military alliance for a non-member to have, which perhaps tells us something about the value that NATO places on WPS. And despite Sweden having a feminist foreign policy, we've not had kind of Sweden articulating the importance of WPS for its membership of NATO, nor is there kind of any evidence of WPS being anywhere in this process. So, and of course, we've got the changing government now in Sweden. So I think the future for WPS at NATO, on the one hand, we have kind of huge policy commitments, but on the other hand, we have kind of huge silences. And I think this is a really important juncture, and I think one that we as kind of the WPS community need to be looking to and asking some quite hard questions about. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Another really interesting talk. And I was reflecting as you were talking, we have some volunteers, some female volunteers from the region, Ukraine, Russia, and they expressed quite a few times their frustration at the media coverage and its lack of sort of gendered awareness of what's actually happening on the ground. So I can really, see that reflected in their experiences. Okay, so yeah, before we come to questions, I'm going to come to our final speaker, Dr. Toni Haastrup. She's a senior lecturer in international politics at the University of Stirling. And her research explores the nature of global power hierarchies. So I think that theme of global power has come across quite strongly in the speakers so far. Today, she'll be discussing the future of women, peace and security. So if I can, I'll mute myself and welcome you to speak. Would you like to share slides as well?
Yes, but we'll see if it actually ends up working, because I tend to be very bad at these things. Unfortunately.
That's okay. It's okay. There's no such thing as a completely smooth Zoom event. It's not possible to achieve.
We'll see if it works, and if it doesn't, then let's see, share. Do you see anything?
It's just, yeah, if you click on present mode, I think we'll be absolutely ready to go then.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, so we can see the screen. I think if you just click on start slideshow or F5, and then we'll see the full screen.
I've actually done that on my end, but for some reason, I've been having this problem.
I think we've got good, we can see the slides, so I think that will work fine if you click through those.
Okay, can you see all of it? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's
I'm just gonna increase a little bit. Yeah, apologies for that. I guess because I use Teams more often, it's still a bit strange. Okay, all right. Thanks everyone for being here today, and Susie and the Welsh Institute for Peace for welcoming us here. It's my pleasure to share the panel with Soumita and Katharine. And I thought the discussion actually has linked in quite well. So with Soumita sort of speaking about the regional dimension, and Katharine sort of focusing on specific practices of current crisis. I'm sort of looking back a bit, but also trying to look forward, drawing on some of the work that I've previously done with Katharine, but also especially with Jamie Hagan at Queen's Belfast, and just feeding into some of my thoughts right now around the women, peace and security. This particular talk, I guess, is also very much influenced by what's been happening at the global level with respect to WPS and the future of WPS, and especially my participation in that process of, I guess you could call it a sort of renewal of WPS. So as Susie mentioned earlier, the WPS agenda is, for all intents and purposes, relatively new. So it's been 2 decades, which when you say it like that sounds like a really long time, but when you sort of situate that amongst other sort of global norms, it's relatively new, and yet its uptake has actually been pretty significant. Okay, so as far as I know, over 90 countries now have adopted some sort of national action plan, which is focused specifically on women, peace and security agenda. A lot of regional organizations, so we've seen with NATO, but also the European Union, the African Union, and indeed others make some sort of reference to the women, peace and security agenda. So it seems like this sort of framework that everyone can sort of get behind. And I think that that's pretty significant if we, again, situate it within a broader dynamic of, you know, to what extent do people really pay attention to, you know, global governance issues that are calling for often marginalized and minoritized people to be acknowledged. So I think, in a sense, when we sort of look at this first 2 decades, I think that is an achievement. And yet, despite this sort of adoption of the National Action Plan, I think my sense is exactly as Soumita alluded to earlier, that, you know, we do see the uptake of the ideational. It seems like it's a really good idea to want to do WPS. But when we start to sort of dig down into sort of implementation, we see that there are significant gaps. And those gaps exist in a variety of ways. So one is that there is a gap between the ways in which countries in the global north think about women, peace and security, and the ways in which countries in the global south think about women, peace and security. I want to highlight here that there is no monolithic global south or global north, indeed, but these are, I guess you could say, archetypes, and we do sort of see similarities. So if I was to reflect on some of what Soumita has said earlier about the South Asia context, I can very much see similar going on in the African context. So I can sort of say there is a kind of thread. And why is this? Why is this that despite the fact that, you know, we've got over 190 something odd countries, they're all very, very different, they're very distinct, and there's no reason for us to look at them in monoliths. Why do we sort of see commonalities with countries in the global north versus countries in the global south? Well, I think it's because of something that was mentioned earlier, that WPS still exists within a global international system that is hierarchical, a global international system that still tends to reify militarization, a global hierarchical system that is very patriarchal, that would prefer to see women as victims rather than agents, and that would prefer to not sort of think about security through peace, but through very specific understandings of security in very narrow ways. And I think that has also then had an impact on implementation. If we think about these global power hierarchies, it effectively means that the global north countries are wealthier. And in that sense, they can sort of determine what the priorities of implementation is. That's what we see in the first 2 decades. And the global south countries, although they've been very instrumental to articulating indeed what the WPS is in 2000. So if we sort of look at the influence of Latin American, Asian, and African women in coming up with the Windhoek Declaration that then became the WPS agenda. Often this is not a story that we tell a lot. This role is often marginalized, even though the actual work, the everyday work of it, is done by a lot of women in transnational contexts, in solidarity, including with feminist and women's rights organizations in the global north. But we don't really hear those stories. And so you kind of have this idea that WPS is something that, is created in the UN. It's diffused to other regions of the world, and then states have to take it up. And then you've got, NATO, the EU, the African Union, ASEAN, and so on. So you got that defined. And again, because these countries are the ones that tend to have the financing, it's unsurprising that this happens. But the second part of the story is linked to that financing, that because of the financing, the extent to which much can be done on the WPS, when the priorities are very much determined by what seems to be finite resources, has been very slow. And this is something that was highlighted in a sort of 2015 review, sort of a 15-year review of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. The biggest issue had to do with funding. And I think that it's important to sort of state that this continues to be a source of tension, because I think regardless, given the depth of what needs to be done, and I think a lot of that has been highlighted in the previous presentations, that you do need resourcing, that you need money to pay people who are best equipped to do the work, that in order to have gender focal points, you have to put financial resources there. And resources people like the work that they're doing actually matters, because frankly, it is life and death. And we don't necessarily have that. But I think another dimension that we've really seen in the first 2 decades is that the normative edifice on which WPS currently relies, or has relied on in the last 2 decades, is quite shaky. And what do I mean by this? In 2000, and indeed prior to 2000, so Susie, you mentioned earlier about the sort of Beijing Platform for Action, for example, in the 1990s. But you can also think of frameworks like CEDAW that have been really instrumental to pushing this agenda finally onto a body that can actually make decisions about realizing that we should probably pay attention to women and gender perspectives in international security. But it's of course not new. Now, who was pushing this agenda? It was feminists. And feminists were pushing this agenda because they wanted transformation. It wasn't just lip service. This is not to suggest that every single feminist that has been invested in WPS prior to 2000 and indeed after have the exact same understanding of feminism or have the exact same priorities. But I think there is something to be said for the feminism that sort of infused and really motivated why there was a sense that there had to be something like the WPS. In the aftermath, and perhaps even in 2000, I think most feminist scholars would now agree that what we see in 1325, the first of the resolutions, is a relatively watered down version of what some people might have liked. And why is it relatively watered down? Because fundamentally, it does not seek to transform this hierarchical system that I have mentioned, right? And feminists want transformation, that if we sort of transform the logics of what security is and what peace can be, then actually we won't have that much reason to keep going to war about things. So this is, what was being proposed here wasn't how do we make women, peace, and security work for things as they are, the status quo, or I believe in the words of Laura Shepard, it's not about making war safe for women, because war in of itself is not something that we should be okay with. That is not to suggest that wars don't happen, but I think the normalization of it is partly what was being critiqued, and we didn't really see an opening for that in the eventual resolution. And then since that resolution, which relied on 4 pillars, participation, prevention, protection, and relief and recovery, we found that one of the pillars has been reified much more so than all of the other ones. That pillar is protection, which again really doubles down on this making war safe for women, but it also doubles down on really seeing women as victims. Unsurprisingly then, the focus of that pillar in practice has very much been around gender and sexual violence in conflict. This, of course, does not attend necessarily to gender and sexual violence in non-conflict situations, in crisis situations. And we know that in the everyday, women, but also other gender and sexual minorities are impacted by gender and sexual violence. There's really no room to engage with this. Now, on the one hand, given the magnitude of the issue, it's very good that some countries are really paying attention to this issue. And in fact, it's the one issue that everyone can get behind. But nevertheless, it really narrows the field for what WPS is or what it can be when we leave behind the injunction to sort of think about the ways in which women can participate in political and everyday life much more substantively, when we leave aside the fact that the WPS agenda was calling for conflict prevention as a whole, not just preventing conflict for women when war is already going on, but how do we upend the system that conflict is no longer a thing? And then we see over those 20 years a real focus on developing national action plans. This was recommended by the UN as the way in which to ensure that you kind of have a strategy to follow as a state, as a regional organization, or any sort of institution. But where we've seen a proliferation of national action plan, and in some cases we've seen 4 per country, where has that actually left us? I think the feminist edge of this agenda has been lost over time. And I sense that, there's also been a realization, and that's what's kind of brought us to where we are now. So that's in this sort of story of doom and gloom, nevertheless, you do see some unusual actors. And in my case, my work tends to focus a lot on the African Union, where we've sort of seen the emergence of both the special envoy and her actual office of really championing the WPS agenda in the African context, in the context of conflict, but also outside of conflict, where we've actually seen greater movement across some of the other pillars and a lot more discourse on prevention, even if not much has actually happened with that. Much more engagement and initiatives around participation and leadership that are actually substantive. But nevertheless, this space is still disadvantaged by the funding issue that I've mentioned, but also the hierarchies, because when you sort of look at the African context, where funding for the African Union, but also for the WPS, still very much reliant, not on the member states of the African Union, but on external donors. So they get to call the shots about, what we need to be prioritizing with respect to WPS. And even when there is space for dialogue and engagement, in the end, where we're trying to link WPS to existing priorities of global North countries especially, it becomes very difficult to sort of move and chart one's own path. So that inequality persisted in those first 2 decades. And this is something that the UN Women, who's been tasked with kind of seeing the implementation globally, realized. And so in around sort of 2019, well, and I guess even before then, but really taking off in 2019, 2020, there was a sense that we need a sort of reckoning with WPS. But actually, we need a reckoning with WPS in a broader context of increasing inequality, especially inequality towards women, but also inequality towards LGBTQIA folks. And this is where we sort of saw the creation and the establishment of the Generation Equality Forum. Generation Equality Forum was developed as a kind of reflection on Beijing, so going back, way back on Beijing itself, and sort of thinking through how do we meet, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals when we do not take seriously the things that feminists have been telling us for years and years and years, for decades. So this was sort of a global revisiting of Beijing, including the Women, Peace and Security agenda, because actually a lot of the legwork around the Women, Peace and Security agenda did start in Beijing. It was a lot of the same communities that were lobbying for what we now consider to be the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And the outcome of Generation Equality was a sort of 5-year acceleration plan that included $40 billion in financial commitments from private organizations, member states of the United Nations, as well as in-kind commitments from various types of institutions. One of the things that I think was really unique about this process is that, unlike the WPS agenda in 2000, where it was the sort of feminist organizations that were already working with these institutions that were involved, this was an open, very open process. So there was a precise commitment on the part of the UN to explore issues around hierarchies, particularly racial and gendered hierarchies within the international system, to reflect on the ways in which these things have affected both the implementation of WPS itself, but also how WPS is situated within the broader global governance. There was an acknowledgement that the lack of funding remained a serious obstacle, that women and girls continue to be excluded from both formal and informal peace processes, that we needed more women in leadership, and that where women were already leading, we needed to acknowledge that. So this wasn't about like training women to be leaders, but acknowledging the ways in which leadership was actually already happening and just giving space and acknowledgement for that. Thinking through the ways in which women's economic position often absents them from the processes of decision-making around crisis, conflict, and within their communities. And finally, really focusing on the ways in which conflict, going back to that prevention pillar, inhibits the possibilities of women, children, LGBTQI individuals living their full lives. So this was pretty significant, and it seemed as if, here we were negotiating on the basis of something that progressive feminists have been pushing for, and I think much more so than in 2000. So what comes out of this is the WPS Humanitarian Action Compact, so WPS-HA Compact. And this compact is ostensibly intergenerational because there was a lot of emphasis on learning from those who were there at Beijing, but also acknowledging the important role of young feminists and creating a movement for implementing and realizing the vision of the WPS agenda, and indeed realizing the vision of peace fundamentally. It was calling actively for a redesign and rethinking of the ways in which we understand peace and security processes and the architectures that underpin them. And this framework, of course, builds on the work that had been done on WPS more broadly. But one of the things, as I said, I found really fascinating about it is that the process was quite open in who could contribute to even like the tiniest of the text. And this was, at least personally for me, a really exhilarating process. This process was also signaling that doing WPS wasn't just down to states or regional organizations, but actually it was down to everyone. And it wasn't just down to civil society organizations to be pushing. It included here for the first time private companies, but also explicitly had actions for academics. So here there was an acknowledgement, given that some of fundamental critique had always been that, you know, there hasn't been that there more research was needed, and the UN as well as regional organizations and states didn't always know how to access that research. And where in the past 20 years, we've sort of seen that it's the same people over and over again who get to interact with these governmental organizations. They were finally opening up the space to say, well, actually, more people can also be engaged, including universities, research organizations, think tanks, as well as civil society. But also that there was a distinction being made between the work that civil societies can do and the ones that, for example, academic institutions or research institutions are able to undertake. And part of this process meant that once the compact was ready, organizations could sign on to committing to enacting parts of the compact. And so representing my organization, the University of Stirling, we are one of the first academic institution signatories to this WPS compact. Now, I think it's really important to say that it's impossible that we're going to be able to enact everything within the new compact. And so there are specific sections where only academic institutions are able to enact, but also not every academic action can be undertaken by just one organization. And I think one of the things that we've discovered in both writing out what it is that academic institutions can do, but also committing to doing certain things, is that similar to the problem that the WPS has always had, funding becomes a really significant issue. But at the same time, this for us, it gives us an opportunity, for example, to bring WPS into the classroom in a way that we weren't able to do before. So this isn't just me telling my students, this is what the WPS is about, but sort of saying, this is what we can do in terms as researchers to implement the WPS. And I think that creating that opening, that process of knowledge making is an important shift, just as much as the sort of material implementation of the WPS. So look into the future and to sort of close out. I think there are now lots of signatories to this new framework. So as I said, it doesn't replace any of the resolutions, but it builds on them. And I think it's much more concrete than it previously had been. And a lot of countries are committed, regional organizations are committed. There are board members who are tasked with ensuring that we evaluate this on a regular basis, to update it if it needs to be updated. But I guess to sort of close out, given that we're in this forum, I want to encourage institutions like yourselves to consider being signatories, because I think previously there was always a sense that, we can only do certain things when you sort of think about the resolution. But the new compact that replaces or sort of brings together all that is possible under the resolutions, and indeed beyond, because this compact talks beyond just women, does allow us everyday people to actually participate in this process. And I think in that sense, thinking about the future is that, WPS is for all of us. As long as WPS is for all of us, and if WPS can be for all of us, then there's hope that it will do the work that it is supposed to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Haastrup, for preempting one of my questions, which is this idea of how do everyday people and organizations get involved. And it's absolutely brilliant to finish your speech on that call to action. So we've got about 15 minutes left, and I've got a couple of questions that are open here, which I'll start with. And then if we've got time, I've got one or two of my own to finish with. So just the first question here, which is sort of directed initially towards Dr. Wright. Why do you think NATO isn't reinforcing its commitments with WPS in Ukraine? Do you think it's a matter of priorities? Is it an oversight? Is it being deliberately avoided? What are your kind of thoughts on that?
I have unmuted myself. Thank you. And thank you, Amy, for this question. I think it's a really interesting one. So WPS, I think, is important for NATO, but it's perhaps important in that it serves an instrumental purpose. So WPS has given value to NATO in terms of building partnerships with states such as Ukraine. And if we think about so if we think about if NATO built its relationship with Ukraine on WPS since 2014, so when we had kind of the initial Russian incursions into Ukraine, that was an incredibly sensitive time for NATO to be working with Ukraine. So women, peace and security, I think, was perceived as kind of a safe issue, in inverted commas, so something that wouldn't further provoke Russia to perhaps invade further. So it was an issue that NATO could liaise with Ukraine on. Now that Russia has invaded Ukraine fully, NATO no longer, and there's no kind of question that Russia's intentions, NATO doesn't need to tread that diplomatic line with Russia in the same way. So it doesn't need to exploit the women, peace and security agenda as kind of an alibi for its relationship there. So this is all incredibly problematic, and this all completely undermines the purpose of the women, peace and security agenda. And this is why I think that was such a good question, and why this is something we should be paying attention to. So thank you.
Thanks so much. I sort of think of the phrases greenwashing and SDG washing, and I wonder if there's a bit of WPS washing as a phrase we can coin for this. Thanks so much. And the next question, which I think has been slightly answered, but I will come back for an expansion. So Dr. Haastrup, you were mentioning about that sort of need for more substantive participation of women in everyday political life with respect to WPS. Are there any other examples or ideas you could give about how best to do this? And the person asking the question has said, especially in the Southern African context.
Okay, thank you so much for that question. I mean, I think Southern Africa, don't know all, I'm not as familiar with the dynamics of all the countries in Southern Africa, but I know a little bit about South Africa itself, and maybe to an extent Malawi and Zimbabwe, that these places have vibrant civil society and vibrant feminist organizations. And the work that they do in the everyday, some of these organizations are not massive. They don't have the resources, I think, as Soumita mentioned earlier, to be the ones who go and apply for the big grants. And I think that the onus would be on governments, especially, so those departments responsible for WPS, to really make an effort to bring in the smaller organizations, the organizations in more rural areas, to think through, for example, I was having an earlier discussion about the hegemony of the English language, for example, translating WPS material in sort of local languages so that people actually know how it's relevant to them, and not assuming that, people in, say, Pretoria are bringing the lessons or insights of WPS to a rural community, but actually opening up the space to find out what kinds of things can we learn about leadership in these communities. What can we learn about peace, conflict mediation from community leaders and from community elders? And how can we potentially upscale that or just learn from those processes, and how that might inform, for example, South Africa's role in, say, Mozambique, for example, where we currently have a crisis. So I think that states and governments, because they have the resources and they have a broader knowledge of, the country as a whole, can create that space through which there can be better engagement between the center, as it were, and the margins. So that would just be, the way. I don't think there can be one specific example, because I think that there are different country contexts, but there can be pathways through which to help this engagement a bit more. And I think also in the African context more broadly, given the existence of the Office of the Special Envoy of the African Union, I do think that much more has to be done at the domestic level to actually highlight the fact that, well, actually, there's a lot that we can learn about WPS that is already going on in the everyday.
Thanks so much for that answer. I've got another question which I'm going to ask from the Q&A, and I might cheekily tack on one of my questions to this because I think it's related. So the question here is, are there any examples we can look to of WPS being implemented successfully? And I guess as a sort of add-on to that, Wales likes to, has this ambition to be a feminist nation. And I'm sort of interested in what you think feminist implementation of WPS would look like. So I guess those are kind of linked questions. I don't know who would like to come in first. So I think that's something that any of you could come in on. So if you want to wave at me if you'd like to start. Fantastic, thank you.
Well, I'm sure all of us can answer this. I'll just say a few lines with regard to the successes, and we see some successes in peacekeeping. Incidentally, for another project, I was looking at some of the numbers on the UN website yesterday, and just in terms of the heads of missions, the numbers, there are a lot more women heads and deputy heads of missions when it comes to UN peace operations. There are also women peacekeepers, and in fact, in 2007, India sent an all-female formed police unit, which was then deployed in Liberia. And that was hugely successful. And it was not only something that was, I think the important bit is not that it was appreciated internationally, but that the Liberian population really connected with the female peacekeepers. And of course, we are academics, so there is obviously a flip side to this as well, which is the concern that there is an instrumentalization that, okay, we're just adding women, but are we really challenging the nature of peacekeeping? So that's there, but that is one of the successes. And also, I think in several local contexts, I remember one of the earliest examples was when in Liberia, the women's groups that, were calling for them to participate, to kind of get themselves onto the peace negotiation table, they kind of used 1325, which had been adopted fairly recently, to call for this. So it can become quite an useful advocacy tool for participation and for calling attention to specific aspects. And it could be something as, the nitty gritty. Sam Cooke has this very interesting article on, it could just be about buying flashlights when you are walking through refugee camps, because that can help actually prevent sexual violence against women and girls. But also, of course, the WPS agenda talks about conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys. And just briefly, with regard to your the point about feminist implementation of WPS, all I'll say right now is that, in fact, we could even relate it to these ideas of feminist foreign policy, right? And they actually they really connect with each other, and neither is perfect in its implementation, right? Because there's always going to be something that is missing, but just that we have WPS and that we are thinking of having, feminist policies. And in concrete terms, it could be about, participation and all those aspects. Yeah, that can be done. I guess I didn't have a very concrete answer to that question. Thanks.
Thanks so much. No, really, really useful answer. And just any thoughts on that from Dr. Wright or Dr. Haastrup? Go ahead, Dr. Haastrup.
Yeah. No, I don't think I have that much to add. The one thing I would say is, in terms of success, first of all, the fact that national action plans are being created in the first instance, that is a goal of the agenda itself. And that should be, that's why I started with that. That is a massive success in of itself, right? So, I mean, there's more to say about the extent to which all of them are acknowledged, etc. So I would say that's a big success. The fact that through the WPS agenda, often there's a greater facilitation of transnational engagements between specific women's groups, but also different types of formal institutions that are taking WPS up. This was partly part of the aims at the very beginning. So I think that that's really important. And every October now, you kind of have an open session at the UN that is dealing specifically with WPS. This is part of what we might consider to be the institutionalization of the WPS agenda. We've not seen anything like that before, regardless of, again. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's not where I think, I would say all of us want it to be. And I think that's important to highlight. But I also think that there are successes and we cannot discount that. And there are sort of more internal success. So if you go across each of the almost 100 countries that have national action plans, there are gains that they've made that allows them to move on to something else when they have the next national action plan, build off or revisit certain things if it did not work out as well. It would take forever to document across all of these countries. In the African Union, I guess I can give one example that sort of acknowledging WPS helped to create a zero tolerance policy for African Union deployed peacekeepers around sexual violence where they're based. And this is particularly significant because when the same issue arose at the UN level, there was a lot of hand-wringing because it's the member states that are often responsible for the conduct of their soldiers. So the UN was very much like, yeah, of course, we like this idea, but how much more, what more can we do? Whereas by creating a zero tolerance policy that can be implemented by the African Union level, you can sideline entire groups if they've been accused and found to be guilty of having committed sexual violence. And there are a range of other, examples. In my work, I look at participation. So the creation of FemWise, which is kind of women peace mediators, would be a success of WPS specifically. The creation of the African Women's Leadership Network is also a success of thinking about leadership in the context of WPS. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I'm conscious we've got 2 minutes left before 2 o'clock. So, Dr. Wright, did you have a very brief thought you wanted to add?
I can be very, very quick. So I think, and I guess I'll go back to the NATO context. So I guess the success of WPS there is, number one, that NATO for the first time ever consults civil society, including feminist civil society, in its policy-making process, which is huge. And also, number two, despite all the issues of NATO's work on WPS, there are some incredibly dedicated kind of gender experts working within NATO to push the agenda forward in positive ways. And I think that needs highlighting as well as a success.
Diolch yn fawr. Thank you so much to our fantastic panelists. I feel like I've learned a huge amount in the last hour and a half. And thank you to Amira also for coordinating the event and those who have attended. I'd just like to close, I think, on that last, on the call to action. I think sometimes these agendas can be quite difficult to understand. There's quite a lot of technical language. If you're not an academic in the area, it can take a little while to look into, but actually there are opportunities for people, for institutions to get involved in this agenda, and it's incredibly important. So following the event, we'll look to share some of the links of the areas that the speakers mentioned. And if speakers are happy for us to share the slides as well, that might be really helpful. Thank you. So we'll share a few links so that we can make sure those in the audience can also, as well as learning, can take action which is what at the Welsh Centre for International Affairs we're all about. So huge diolch yn fawr, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll hear from you again.